All right.
All right, Vic, I'd like you to tell us something about yourself.
Your name?
Yeah.
Your name.
I'm Victor Lim, and I was born in '44 in San Francisco. Um, I'm the descendant of a gold miner that came in the 1850s. So I guess I'm fourth generation. Um, I was raised in El Cerrito, and I went to school there. Went to Berkeley and went to optometry school, and started a practice in Davis. Practiced there for 35 years, and very active in the community. Got lots of awards. So I'm a good representative of the Chinese American community. So.
Yes, you mentioned that you're a descendant of a gold miner.
Right.
This on which side
This
of
is.
the family?
It was a Lim. So my grandfather's only Lim grandson, and he was number one grandson, number one son from the gold miner. Right.
So that was your great grandfather.
Right. Right.
Now, how about the side that represents the railroad?
That's
Now,
he's the man.
Oh, he's the man.
He's the man. So we're the direct descendants of the gold miner.
So your
He's a Lim
understanding
also, yeah.
Is that he was a gold miner?
Right.
Did you?
He actually wasn't a gold miner. Initially, he came over when he was like 11 or 12 with his uncle. And from what I heard when I was a youngster, that they were actually on their way to Australia. Now, this is something new that the other cousins hadn't heard. They have a lot of information, but I remember hearing it specifically. Now, whether they changed their mind or got blown off course, I don't know. But I remember hearing as a youngster that they initially were going to go to Australia. So then apparently, but this is all secondhand, that he worked on the railroad. His uncle did gold mining. I'm sure he helped. But he worked on the railroad and was back in Minnesota. There were some records of him being in Minnesota. And the interesting thing is he didn't, most Chinese either died, railroad workers and miners either died or returned to China. That's just the pattern. They were here to make money. He stayed. And the family rumor has always been, and I've got it confirmed more recently, is that, but it's been in the family for years, the rumor, that he probably had an Indian wife and family, and that's why he stayed and didn't return to China. So in the 1880s, they shipped over a bride for him from China, from Canton, and that's will be my great-grandmother. Yeah.
This is Lim Lip Hong.
Right.
Who came in the, you think,
1855, I believe. Yeah,
and
that's
he
what the
was
record.
a young boy, 11 or 12.
Yeah, right. Came with his uncle. Came with
So
his
he
uncle.
would have been in his early 20s when he worked on the transcontinental.
Right. Yeah. And but after working on the railroad, he stayed. And the family rumor was, and I've had it recently reconfirmed, that he might have had a Indian wife and a family with her, and that's why he stayed. Then in the 1880s, he brought over a Chinese wife, and we're the descendants of that lady, woman. I say woman, not a lady. She was supposed to be a real bitch. Just she mistreated my grandmother. I heard many stories of how she mistreated my grandmother.
Was this their life in San Francisco?
Right. They lived in on a farm on Minnesota Street, which is south of China Basin. So they didn't live in Chinatown like most of the Chinese did. They actually lived out on a farm. So Grandpa actually commuted when he went to Chinatown. The family and the kids, in other words, my aunts and uncles all went to school in Chinatown. It was pretty segregated in those days, and all the kids, the Chinese kids went to, I think, Commodore Stockton is the name of the school that they went to. Yeah.
Did your grandfather talk about his father?
You know, my grandfather died when I was 3. Yeah. So everything I've learned is through but basics through my aunts and uncles. I was fortunate that I spent a lot of time with my aunts and uncles. I was an only child, so I spent a lot of time with every weekend with my aunts and uncles, and they talked a lot. And our family was such that everything was discussed in front of the kids. There was never a closed door discussion on anything. So I knew all the good and all the bad about the family.
That's the sense of oral history. You have the oral history of your family.
Yeah, yeah. Sylvia and I have probably the most, but Angie has some, but it's a different from a different angle.
Well, did you have a sense of pride in what your parents and grandparents
Oh
did?
yeah, oh yeah, no
Could you describe
doubt.
that in the work they did?
Yeah, yeah. My grandfather was quite a person, quite a significant person. He was uh, Grandpa Singh was the oldest of the boys. He had 2 older sisters, and one of them was pretty famous too. She was his number 2 sister, and you should get an oral history about that. She was the queen of gambling in San Francisco in the 20s. And then one of her disciples was Chun Bak Hing, who was king of the gamblers in the 30s and 40s. Yeah.
So these were the children of the railroad workers.
Um, yeah, right. The woman, uh, uh, the queen of the gambling. Now the king of the gambling he came later. He wasn't related, although a lot of their kids intermarried. Um, he actually came from China when he was 18. That's Chun Bak Hing. But you need to do a thing on him. You might not get anything out of the kids though. They're really mum about.
But what kind of work did your grandfather do?
All right. Apparently, you got to realize my great grandfather didn't have kids, at least Chinese kids, for a long time. So so my grandfather, number 1 son, actually went out and worked from about the time he was 11 or 12. He basically supported the family, from what I've heard, from that point on. So that's why great grandpa, in his later days, he was an old man, and he sat around and smoked dope. He was he lived a hard life. So yeah.
How did you know about his first family, the Indian, the Indian wife?
We just heard rumors that because there was this gap from the time he worked on the railroad and in the mines, there was this 20-year gap before our great grandmother came over. Yeah, so it was the assumption. The assumption substantiated by rumors. Yeah.
And that family was left in Minnesota? Or
We don't know. We don't know.
you don't know
Yeah.
anything about their descendants?
I've jokingly talked to. I was a retired optometrist. I'm retired. I have some Indian patients, and I meet Indian people once in a while, and always tell them that story and jokingly tell them that you could be my cousin. So, so Grandpa, the number one son, he apparently was a very hardworking guy, very dynamic, was very, very successful in the business world. Um, he apparently was flat wealthy at one time until the Depression came. And like Andrea's mother, who was a gorgeous gal, she spent a decade in the 20s gallivanting, the term was used, gallivanting, all over Asia on these fancy steamboats, and because Grandpa was a wealthy guy. The son, number one son, in other words, my dad's oldest brother, he spent the decade in Hollywood trying to make it in the movie business. And I've seen a picture, I actually found it recently, of Uncle Roy in white spats. You know what white spats are? All right, good. And I heard as a youngster that he had a equivalent of a Ferrari, is a Stutz Bearcat, which is equivalent of a Ferrari today. So Grandpa had lots of money, yeah. So he was in the shipping business. What the business he did was he hired, because he was American, spoke English, even though he wasn't educated. He spoke English, and he had lots of influential friends in San Francisco. He was able to get contracts with these steamship companies to hire Chinese crews from China and crew their ships. So all or most of the large steamship companies on the West Coast and the Pacific had crews that he provided. And of course, he made money providing these crews. So Dollar Line and Pacific Transport, American President Line, they all had crews that were crewed by my grandfather's people. So the only one I've never heard was Matson Line. I don't know whether either they didn't exist at the time or, yeah. But all the other ones were.
Did your grandfather and your uncles, did they talk about discrimination and how that affected their choice of profession and where they went?
They talked about some discrimination on a personal level, but apparently Grandpa didn't. My grandpa must have experienced discrimination, but one of his best friends apparently was a U.S. Senator from California, Hiram Johnson, and I looked it up. Hiram Johnson was elected in 1916. So apparently they were good friends, and I remember my dad telling me that the property on the Minnesota street was actually in Senator Johnson's name because, you know, there were limitations on what we could buy. So the farm that they had was in, that's what I'd heard. Now, we haven't had a chance to look it up in the records, but we probably should sometime. Yeah.
Your family, since they were born, your grandfather was born in the United States.
Right, yeah.
He didn't have the problem with immigration.
Right, yeah. I'm gonna have you stop 1 second. Good. Another person that he mentioned that was good friends of his was a guy named Harry Bridges. Harry Bridges was the and the founder of the Longshoremen's Union. So, of course, my grandfather worked on the waterfront. Yeah. So I'll tell you, kind of this. I'll just kind of jump around. My uncle, my Auntie Fan's husband, Norman Lee, he worked on he worked for State Steamship Company as a freight agent, and he just loved my grandfather. So 2/3 of what I heard about my grandfather came actually from his son-in-law. Some from my dad, some from my Uncle Kwong, but a lot of it from his son-in-law. Apparently, my grandfather got him into the business, the steamship business. So kind of neat thing is when I'm a young 8, 10, 12 years old, every time a new ship would come in, Uncle Norm would take me down to the ship, and we'd have lunch with a captain or something like that. And twice, I remember these specifically. When we were out on the piers, we'd bump into some old guys, and Uncle Norm would, of course, know them because he'd been working on the waterfront for 30 years himself. And he'd say, "Oh, this is Victor. This is Lim Singh's son, a grandson." And I remember there always was positive comments, but one guy specifically said, "Your grandfather was the finest person I've ever known in my life." For this old white guy to say that, kind of has a big impact on a kid, 10-year-old kid. So anyway. So.
Back to your life.
Pardon?
So you had a great sense of pride of.
Oh gosh, yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah.
Your own. It must
Yeah.
have affected your own life.
Oh yeah, yeah. My grandfather and my dad were pretty neat guys, and my uncles, they weren't just regular old folks. They were big time. Yeah.
And your family.
Yeah. I'm going to bring up something. This was earlier now. It'll relate to something around just after the earthquake. When I was a kid, about 13 or 14, I was visiting Uncle Roy, the oldest son. He lived in Sacramento, and there was this scroll that was actually built into the wall. He had actually cut a hole in the wall, indentation, with a light above it that shone on this scroll. And my Uncle Roy told me that this was your grandfather's. This was a knighthood from the Emperor of China, dealing with that knighted your grandfather. And since you're number one only Lim grandson, this was going to be your document someday. And unfortunately, a couple years later, his house completely burned to the ground, along with my scroll. So I just remember, and years later, I always thought, well, it probably wasn't a knighthood. It was probably a commendation. It was about things he did, saving a lot of people. It was described as saving a lot of people and raising a lot of money after the earthquake. Because remember, they lived out of Chinatown. So they would bring a horse and buggy and haul hundreds of Chinese out of the burning Chinatown and back to the farm on Minnesota Street. So anyway, about a couple of years ago, we were just going through family photographs, and I found this picture, and it's the scroll. It's not the scroll, it's a picture of the scroll. So I had it blown up, and I can't read it, but we took it to one of a friend of mine's who's I'd call an Asian scholar, and another person that was a judge in town here that's Judge Julie Tang, and who was raised in Hong Kong and is very educated. Those people went crazy. They, she kept saying, umban, wow, umban, which I didn't know what umban was, but it turns out the level that he was awarded was the highest level you can have outside of the few people that lived inside of the imperial palace. There's 9 levels. The 6 through 9 were stationed inside the imperial palace, and the highest award outside the palace was what my grandfather was. So one person described it as equivalent of like the head of a province, a state the size of California, or a province like Canton province, so anyway, we're kind of starting to research that, maybe trying to find out in China where they have records on it. And apparently the person that presented it to him, his name's on the scroll also, and he wasn't an ambassador. He was apparently as high as a Secretary of State. He wasn't a regular Chinese ambassador to the U.S. He was higher than that. He was a big time guy. Anyway, that's the grandpa that became very wealthy and did the shipping business. So he was a significant human being, certainly significant in our community. So, got some notes on what the businesses he did. You ever eat at Far East Cafe? His family, he and his friends started that. They started the Lim Association, the Tong. So Grandpa Lim was one of the founders of that. Now, all this wealth came to an end when the Depression came, because the steamship companies, there was no commerce at that point. So a lot of the steamship companies went bankrupt, and these ships were parked all over the Pacific. The companies bankrupt, they just parked them, and the crews had to fend for themselves. And the family story is that he had actually used the family savings and the money that the family had to ship all these workers, these that were all over the Pacific, back to Canton province. In the Chinese culture, it was mainly because he made that promise, because if they died, it's very important for Chinese people to be returned and buried in their home, back at their home. So this was a different situation, but he felt he owed them to return them back to Canton. So he basically bankrupted the families by honoring his promise that they'd send them home. So anyway, he was very poor after that, but he did a lot of businesses, kind of struggling because he had still a bunch of kids to put in college. And he was he would go to the butchers. He was the intestines he would sell to Chinatown. He had and I'm looking into this one. My dad had worked in Clear Lake. They had a large, like a 60-foot boat in Clear Lake, which they used to net songyu, which is hardhead or blackfish, not black bass. The ones we saw in these storefronts in Chinatown, in the old days, they only had one fish. It was these blackfish, because they were very hardy and they were freshwater. Now the stores have saltwater tanks, and they have tilapia and all these other fish, and crab and things. But in the old days, it had this some. So he had a contract with the state of California to net these songyu out of Clear Lake. And my dad would work up in the summer, along with my Uncle Kwong, work in the summer helping net these fish. So, but it was, he was in a lot of businesses struggling to get by in the Depression. So my best friend's is a retired former head of Fish and Game, so he's starting to look into this contract he had with my grandpa. So let's see. I covered a lot already, I think. All right. All right. Talk about my dad, my uncles, and my dad Alan was born in 1918, and he went to Berkeley and was a civil engineer, and he graduated just as the war started. He had gone to ROTC and learned to fly. Oh, that's another interesting thing. I suspect he wanted to learn to fly, because his uncle, our family, there's a Uncle Art, which is, I think it's Seisuk, which is, anyway, he was, Uncle Art learned to fly from the Wright brothers, and he actually went back to China and became the head of Chiang Kai-shek's Air Force. So he was kind of an example for my dad. So my dad wanted to be a pilot. So he graduated just as the war started. So a lot of Chinese didn't volunteer. A lot of families. I think Grandpa didn't want he or his brother Kwong to volunteer, but they're good old American boys at this point. They wanted to go. So my dad signed up to go to flight school, but there was a regulation that you had to be white. There was non-whites were not allowed to be pilots. So he just checked that he was white, and he was a great candidate. He just graduated from engineering school from Berkeley. He was ROTC. He already knew how to fly, so he got in. And so he went through, and then he was about to be sent overseas. This is early in the war, and most of his unit were killed. So fortunately, he didn't want to go. He wanted to go, but they had shipped him off to train pilots from China. They sent Chinese cadets to Arizona to be trained. It's interesting because those cadets were the ones that his Uncle Art, he was the boss. He was their boss. So he would, he spent the war training Chinese cadets in Arizona. Yeah. So, so years later, not to confirm what he had said, but I just came across some of these old things that he had kept. And a couple years ago, I was looking through this yearbook of of his graduating class of pilots, in 42. And there's a couple hundred pictures in there, and names and pictures. One Chinese guy, one non-white person. There weren't even Eastern Europeans. They were all British, French, German ancestry people. There weren't any Hispanic names in there. There weren't any Polish names, no Jewish names. I show it to you sometime. It is really WASP. And plus one Chinese guy, Lim. So anyway, he wasn't exaggerating when he said he was the only guy. So he was probably, because of his lying on his application, the first Chinese pilot in the American Air Force. So then his brother Kwong was a flight surgeon. So he was a physician, graduated from San Francisco, and actually Sylvie can talk about him. Yeah, but he was quite a guy too.
What was the career that your father had?
He was a civil engineer afterward. Yeah. He worked for the Army and the Navy. He was a very aggressive in order to get anywhere in government. You have to switch jobs, and he switched quite a few times. And he did very, very well. At the last project he was in charge of before he retired, he was head of what they call the MX project, which was like a $2 billion project to design the missile silos that the Russians couldn't destroy. He was telling me how people he knew from engineering school 30 years before were calling him up, "Remember me, Alan?" Because there was so much money involved. Yeah. So then when he retired, he went back and got a master's in public administration, because all the people under him all had masters. But when he graduated in engineering school in the 40s, nobody went on to higher degrees. Everybody just got a bachelor's. He liked it so much, he ended up going for a PhD, and got his PhD, a joint one from Golden Gate and University of California, and he was 74 years old. So.
You were his only child?
Yeah.
And your mother?
Yeah, my mother's a local girl. She's a San Francisco girl.
What's her name?
Lily Chow, and apparently my dad was very handsome. The whole family, my aunts, my uncles were very good looking. But we were we were trying to identify some pictures by showing them to some old people that were in their generation. And this one friend of, as a matter of fact, he lives in this building, his brother lives in this building. He went ape when he saw this picture. I mean, he went crazy. That's Lily Chow. And you could tell, apparently, it was all over his face. He had a crush on her. So anyway, she raised me. My dad chose to build a house in El Cerrito, which was an all-white town at that time. And I never had any problem with racism, but he had lots before. And even when we moved in, since we were the only non-white family in El Cerrito, they petitioned to keep him out. But he said to hell with him. He moved in anyway, and they became his best friends. So yeah.
And your own family? Just a few words about your life.
We moved to Davis when I graduated from optometry school, looking for an area that had good schools. So the college towns always have good schools. And my wife and I had 2 boys. They'd done fine. They did well in school, and my wife and I were in literally every activity in Davis. We were Citizens of the Year, and in a 50,000 town, so it's not a big deal, but it's a big deal in a little fishbowl. And I got lots of awards besides that one, so we worked hard. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Wonderful stories,
Oh,
and the name.
all right. So one story about my dad um, is that, all the Chinese kids all over San Francisco, most of them lived in Chinatown, went to Commodore Stockton. And apparently there was a local school very close by, but it was basically Russian families that live in Potrero Hill. And so he got his sister May to take him over there and enroll him. They didn't want to, but he insisted. So he went to school without any other Chinese kids there. And unfortunately, he developed a great disdain for Russian people because he had to fight with these Russian guys every day of the week. Yeah. And when he was a pilot, later in the war, you've heard this Lend-Lease program. So he was ferrying a bomber, I think up to Alaska, to give to a Russian commander, a Russian pilot, for him to take back to Russia. And the Russian pilot refused to take it from my dad because he was Chinese. If you don't think after fighting with these Russian kids for 10 years, he wasn't pissed, so he made him. Otherwise, he was going to fly the plane back to the United States. But anyway, one other story about my uncle, the flight surgeon, was stationed in I believe North Carolina for a short period of time, and my dad found out that, or they found out that Auntie Kwong's wife had contracted tuberculosis. You know, back in those days, it was like a serious case of AIDS. Nobody survived those. She amazingly was at 5% that did survive. But so he was stationed, of course, in Arizona and he borrowed a B-17 and flew it back to North Carolina, picked up Uncle Kwong, flew him back to the Bay Area to see his wife, and then flew him back to North Carolina and then back to Arizona. So he borrowed a B-17.